One day at Schönbrunn, a lady in mourning, accompanied by 2 children, came to ask for a pardon, which the emperor was forced to refuse. This is what caused this person's visit. A Mrs. Dombray, or Combray, or Ken, had associated herself with certain people of good family who were committing acts of brigandage, of which the whole country complained, but who had the pretension of continuing the Vendée by robbing travelers and stagecoaches. This lady shared the spoils which were carried to the country house which she lived in on the side of the road with the thieves. Napoleon had given the strictest orders for the repression of these criminal attempts against public safety, which were filling the department with consternation. Madame de Combray, arrested, had been found guilty and was condemned. A respite was granted her because the idea had been suggested to her to declare herself pregnant. In spite of the fact that this plea was known to be false, this lady took advantage of the respite to have her pardon prayed for. The emperor, taken by surprise, having received no report on the appeal for mercy, nor any document which might help him to form an opinion, complained bitterly that the ministers of police should grant passports which enabled people to come and take him by surprise at 400 leagues from Paris, leaving to him all the odium of refusing a pardon which he was not in a position to grant. An example, moreover, was necessary. He expressed to the relation of the sentenced woman all his regret that she should have had to undertake so hard a journey in vain. He told her that his minister had supplied him with no information, adding that the nature of the crime in question did not, unfortunately, put it in his power to use his right of pardon. He concluded with a few words which showed the compulsion he was putting upon himself and gave orders that his petitioner should be well treated. I quote this anecdote because people have tried to use it as a pretext for accusing Napoleon of inhumanity. The reader must decide on the point himself. During Napoleon's stay in Vienna, the inhabitants were the victims of a famine, which was caused by the action of the Austrian authorities in forbidding any provisions to be sent into the town because the French soldiers would have made use of them. A deputation, which the emperor had authorized to visit the Emperor of Austria to obtain the recall of this order, had returned without obtaining any immediate satisfaction. Napoleon, touched by the distress of the Viennese, paid a visit to the suburbs and, together with the Intendant General of the Army, took measures for the diminishing the sufferings of the inhabitants. The winter coming on, he authorized the poor of Vienna to help themselves to wood in the imperial forests. We saw files of people passing loaded with stacks of wood which they had cut in these forests for several days. Napoleon tried to preserve people as far as lay in his power from the evils of war. In 1809, the emperor had again fallen in with, at Vienna, the celebrated singer Crescentini, who had been the delight of Italian theaters. He remembered with pleasure that formerly at Milan, Crescentini had sung cantatas intended to glorify the triumphs of the French army. Although this clever singer was no longer a young man, Napoleon attached him to the imperial orchestra and sent him to Paris with a salary of 30,000 francs. From this time on, Crescentini gave up singing on the stage. When age and infirmities had weakened his voice, the emperor appointed him professor to the Bologna Conservatory, where he was ordered to write a book on the laws of his art. At the same time, Napoleon created him a Knight of the Order of the Iron Crown. It was not only with a view of rewarding his musical merit that the emperor accorded him this distinction, to which the title professor gave him a claim. In decorating Crescentini, Napoleon had another purpose and was trying an experiment, for he wished to decorate Talma with the Legion of Honor, a foreign distinction awarded to a professor of singing in Italy, the classical home of music. A favor justified by superior merit was less likely to excite less opposition there than in France. At the same time, this nomination was generally criticized in Italy, and the emperor was forced to admit that, great as was his power, it had its limits. Napoleon saw himself forced to draw back before this manifestation of public opinion, but he regretted that this scruple praiseworthy in its principle, prevented him from honoring a great artist like Talma, who was endowed with unrivaled talents, and whom he held in high esteem. Corvisart, first doctor to the emperor, came to Paris during the 1809 campaign. His presence at headquarters gave rise to the belief that Napoleon was dangerously ill, a circumstance which especially attracted the attention of the English government. Corvisart's journey had not been caused alone by a slight indisposition on the emperor's part, caused by the fatigues of the campaign, but which neither prevented him from riding on horseback nor from holding reviews. The doctor, impelled by curiosity and the interest of science, had asked permission on his side to come to Vienna. He wished to visit the medical establishments of this capital and to make the acquaintance of the celebrated Dr. Frank, who was first doctor to the Emperor of Austria. Numerous cases of dysentery having declared themselves in the army, which it was feared might degenerate into an epidemic. Corvisart's advice became very desirable. I remembered that the emperor jested the doctor on a danger to which the latter had exposed himself whilst visiting the battlefield of Wagram, where it is said he approached a shell which, though the battle had taken place several days before, had not yet been extinguished. Immediately after signing peace, Napoleon left Schönbrunn to return to France. Before leaving, he gave orders that the fortifications of Vienna should be destroyed. He remembered how he had been twice stopped before the walls of this capital and, preoccupied with the idea that he might have to come there a third time, thought of the serious embarrassment which an energetic defense of the city might cause him. Such threatening leave-taking struck dismay into the hearts of the Viennese, who considered themselves humiliated by a precaution, which, ordered after peace had been signed, appeared to them to be dictated by a spirit of revenge and rancor. Napoleon went to await the Emperor of Austria's ratification of the peace at Nymphenburg, where he spent 2 days, and took leave of the King of Bavaria after having received this ratification. He stopped one day at Stuttgart, passing through Strasbourg without stopping, and spent some hours at Chianters, near Bar, under Marshal Oudinot's roof. On October 29th, the emperor arrived at Fontainebleau at 9 a.m. without having been announced. Empress Josephine, not having been told in time, was not there to receive him. Napoleon made this a pretext for showing some bad temper. He seemed to wish to prelude the painful declaration which it was in his mind to make by some subject for discontent. As a matter of fact, his mind was fully made up on his divorce from Josephine. He prepared himself exclusively for it whilst at Fontainebleau, where for 3 weeks he held a large and brilliant court. On his return to Paris on November 16th, Napoleon heard that the ex-queen of Etruria, who had retired to Nice with her son, a young child, on the pretext of ill health, was giving herself up to intrigues of all kinds. She used to write to the English Prince Regent to offer to employ her influence with the Spanish prisoners in cantonment in the depots in the south of France. She wrote to this prince of the embarrassment which her presence in Spain would cause to the French. The ex-queen was mistaking matters. There was danger for her alone. The emperor, not wishing to leave an element of disturbance which might add fresh complications to the state of affairs in Spain in the hands of the English, gave orders that she should be conducted to Rome. She was placed in a convent of which a princess of Parma, her relation, was the abbess. Napoleon informed King Charles IV, at that time in residence at Marseille, of what had happened and pointed out to him what steps had been, as a measure of prudence, rendered necessary by his daughter's ill-considered conduct. Before approaching the great event of the emperor's marriage and divorce, it may be well to pass in rapid survey the state of our affairs in the Spanish peninsula. Austria's declaration of war, enforcing Napoleon to leave Spain, had served the coalition better than the untimely rising of the Spaniards. Napoleon's absence was sadly felt in the peninsula, where our military operations were characterized by a want of ensemble and harmony. Brilliant successes had been achieved, but had not been followed by any decisive results. A want of unity in the command and the dissensions of the marshals amongst themselves prevented the fruits of these victories from being gathered in. To remedy this bad state of affairs, Napoleon replaced Marshal Jourdan in the functions of Major General to King Joseph by Marshal Soult, who was younger and had more experience in making war in the emperor's own fashion. As to Portugal, she had been abandoned. Military operations were being carried on with more success in the east. General Suchet, appointed commander of the army of Aragon, had restored discipline, abundance, and victory. The taking of the fortified places of Aragon and Catalonia and the occupation of Valencia won this general the baton of Marshal and the title of Duke of Albufera. It is sad to have to add that Ferdinand, on hearing of the victories which had been gained over his countrymen, who formerly had been his subjects, addressed to the emperor in his and his brother's names the most obsequious congratulations couched in the most humble expressions, and protested his sincere respect for and blind submission to the imperial will. Since 1792, Europe had been making war on France, a war of extermination, and France had come forth victorious. The bitterness of her enemies, far from crushing her, had rendered her great and powerful. The emperor thought that a marriage with a foreign princess would calm the anxiety of the powers, which would then no longer have reason to fear revolutionary propaganda, that this tie would enforce the acknowledgement of his glory, would diminish the dangers of the retrocessions which France would be obliged to make when universal peace was established, and in one word, would become the means of a lasting peace. He foresaw also that the want of a natural heir would, after his death, hand the empire over to rival ministers, as had formerly happened to the empire left by Alexander the Great. Nevertheless, Napoleon hesitated for a long time before breaking the union which was endeared to him by long-standing and true attachment. Politics, the future peace of the world, imperiously commanded the accomplishment of his design. His age forbade him from longer hesitation. Some have said he was prompted by the vain desire to mix his blood with that of the royal houses. But it may be asked what reasons he had to envy them, either in greatness or in genius or in power. If vanity, there was in his action. If in this matter Napoleon showed himself open to human weaknesses, it had very little voice in determining his resolution. The assiduity with which the ruling families in Europe sought after an alliance with him by marriage did not raise the merit and value of such an alliance in his eyes, though it was a further guarantee of the advantages which he looked for from it. Some time previously, Fouché had taken the opportunity, without being authorized to do so, to approach Empress Josephine on the necessity of a divorce, and to spread the report that a divorce was imminent. Napoleon had severely reprimanded him, not only because he had come to no definite decision on the subject himself, but because he was anxious to spare the unhappy princess premature grief, and did not wish to leave her under the continual menace of a separation, which was painful for both. When, on his return from Fontainebleau, at the end of 1809, Napoleon had made up his mind to open this serious question. He allowed the Empress to suspect the separation, which he was planning only a few weeks before the time when this very painful sacrifice had to be accomplished, not in an outspoken manner, but rather by dropping hints which gave her cause for reflection. This man, whom many people have long considered as pitiless, dreaded the sight of tears and of affliction, against which, as a matter of fact, he was always defenseless. I have often seen him, after certain scenes of jealousy caused by Josephine's suspicious affection, so troubled that he would remain for hours in his workroom, given up to silent emotion and unable to resume his work. Napoleon had retained from his early education, family, feelings, and simple ways of life, which in his case were united with the highest political capacities. Since the interview of Erfurt, time had matured Napoleon's project of a divorce. The cordiality which seemed to reign between the Tsar and himself familiarized himself with the idea that a family alliance would strengthen between them the intimacy which held out the prospect of great advantages. Monsieur de Talleyrand asserts that he was commissioned by Napoleon to sound the Emperor Alexander on this subject. However this may be, it is certain that in the course of one of the familiar conversations between the two emperors at Erfurt, Alexander offered Napoleon the hand of the Grand Duchess Anna. Napoleon bound himself by no engagement, but he had felt pleased and flattered by this offer, which remained a secret between the two sovereigns. When, towards the end of 1809, on his return from the Wagram campaign, Napoleon made public his decision to seek for children in a new matrimonial alliance, since he could expect no posterity from his marriage with Josephine, his first thoughts were for an alliance with the princess of the Russian imperial house. Whilst commissioning his representative in St. Petersburg to approach Emperor Alexander in a confidential manner in this matter, two other princesses, one, the only daughter of the King of Saxony, the other, the eldest daughter of the Emperor of Austria, were in his mind. Although his desire to have children as soon as possible threw weight into the scale on the side of the Princess Augusta or Archduchess Marie Louise, who suited him better on account of her age, Napoleon still hesitated. The agreement of his political views with his personal inclination for Emperor Alexander and the remembrance of the offer made by this prince at Erfurt decided him to take up again the proposal, to which he had given no definite answer, and to prefer a marriage with a Russian princess. It was about a week after the Minister of Foreign Affairs had written in a confidential manner to the Duke of Vicence, Caulaincourt, our minister at St. Petersburg, charging him to open the subject of the marriage in a categorical manner to Emperor Alexander, when Napoleon made up his mind to break his silence towards Empress Josephine. The minister's letter had been ciphered by himself and was to be deciphered by the Duc de Vicence. Caulaincourt alone, since the insinuations made 2 years before by Fouché to the Empress, and although this mischievous marplot had been publicly disavowed, Josephine could not help seeing that sooner or later she would have to pay for the misfortune of not having given an heir to Napoleon with the loss of her rank. It was the general topic of her conversation, either with me, from whom she hoped to gather some information, or with those with whom she could speak in confidence. But after the emperor's arrival at Fontainebleau, where, as we have read, he returned after the Wagram campaign, new signs confirmed her suspicions and made her foresee that the storm might break at any moment. An unaccustomed coldness, the closing of the doors which communicated between their two apartments, the shortness of the rare moments which the emperor devoted to his wife, certain passing outbursts provoked by the most trifling causes which troubled this family, usually so peaceful, the arrival in turn of the allied sovereigns, whose presence she was not able to understand, inspired the Empress Josephine with the keenest anxiety. So cruelly was she troubled that she was constantly applying to me. I could only answer her in an evasive way. My part became an embarrassing one, and in order to escape from the unhappy princess's questions, I was obliged to avoid her. But my perseverance in escaping from what I may call her importunities appeared to her more significant than words, and her anxiety reached its highest pitch when by hazard she was able to keep the emperor with her for a moment. She did not dare to touch on this question for fear that the fatal sentence should fall from his lips. Such a state of things could not be greatly prolonged. Its result had been to strain the relations between the two spouses to a point which was downright torture for both. The emperor was at last unable to bear it any longer, and one evening, after the most silent and sorrowful of meals, he broke the ice. It may be imagined what was the grief and despair of the Empress Josephine at the moment when her last hope was taken away. Napoleon, freed from an insupportable load, was deeply touched by the grief which he was causing, and from that moment he never ceased to surround her with every care and to lavish upon her words of comfort, which Josephine in her despair at first listened to with indifference, but which touched her in the end. Napoleon sent for her children, Hortense and Eugène, and committed their mother to their care, assuring them of the continuance of his paternal affection and protection. After having calmed the first transports of her grief, Josephine bore her sacrifice with a force of character of which one might not have thought her capable, and resigned herself to this misfortune for which there was no remedy. From that day, she was seen no more at court. She, however, came out of her voluntary retirement on 2 subsequent occasions. Once to be presented in a pew at Notre Dame at the Te Deum, which was sung for the Peace of Vienna, and once to accompany the emperor to the mansion house to the fête which the city of Paris gave on that occasion. With the exception of these 2 circumstances, she spent hiding in her apartment the fortnight which passed between the moment when this cruel revelation was made to her and the day when the divorce was pronounced. However painful this fortnight must have been for both, it seemed a terribly short time to Josephine, who could not accustom herself to the idea of the loss of her rank, and above all, of being separated from Napoleon, whom she dearly loved. The emperor soothed the last hours of their married life by acts of the kindest consideration and respect, caring for the future of the wife whom he was leaving, advising her, and meeting her every wish.